The wind howled through the empty fields as James finished stacking firewood by the porch. The sky was a deep gray, with heavy rain threatening to fall at any moment. His loyal dog, Max, had been out exploring for hours. James wasn't worried. Max always found his way home, no matter how far he wandered. Just as James turned to head inside, he heard the sound of paws against the wet dirt. Max was racing toward the house, his tail wagging furiously. But there was something strange. Behind him, a figure stumbled forward. A young woman with pale blue skin and white hair. Her clothes were torn and unfamiliar, as if from another world. She leaned on Max, her steps shaky, and her eyes darted around in fear. James froze. This wasn't something you saw every day. Who was she? Where had she come from? The question spun in his head as Max barked once, as if to tell him to do something. "Who are you?" James asked cautiously, stepping closer. The woman looked at him but didn't respond. Her lips moved, but the sounds she made weren't any language James had ever heard. She seemed weak, her hands trembling as she clung to Max's fur. Max whined and nudged her, clearly concerned. James could see she was injured. Scratches covered her arms, and her knees were scraped and bleeding. She wasn't a threat, just scared and hurt. All right, James said, his voice softening. "Come inside. Let's get you cleaned up." He guided her into the house, Max staying by her side like a protective shadow. Inside, James grabbed a towel and some first aid supplies. The woman sat quietly on the couch, her eyes scanning the room. She flinched at the sound of thunder rumbling outside. James worked quickly, cleaning her wounds while Max sat at her feet, resting his head on her lap. The woman seemed to relax a little, gently patting Max's head in gratitude. James couldn't help but notice how protective Max was being, almost as if he brought her home on purpose. "You've really outdone yourself this time, buddy," James muttered, glancing at Max. The dog wagged his tail, clearly pleased with himself. The woman tried to speak again, but her words were still incomprehensible. Frustrated, she looked around and picked up a pencil from the table. On the back of an old receipt, she drew a crude sketch, a small oval, like a pod, surrounded by jagged lines. James guessed it was some sort of crash. Her finger pointed to herself, and then to the drawing, her expression pleading. "You crashed, like fell from the sky?" James asked, trying to piece it together. She nodded quickly, relief washing over her face as he understood. This was getting stranger by the minute. James didn't know what to think. Was she an alien? He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the signs were hard to ignore. Pale blue skin, white hair, and the way she looked at everything as if it was completely new to her. She didn't belong here. Despite the question swirling in his mind, James felt a strange responsibility. She was hurt and scared, and Max had brought her to him for help. That was all that mattered for now. "All right," he said, standing up. "You can stay here tonight. We'll figure this out in the morning." The woman looked at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. She clasped her hands together and bowed her head slightly. Max barked happily, as if to seal the deal. As James pulled the blanket over her, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet life had just been turned upside down. Whoever, or whatever, she was, her arrival was only the beginning of something far bigger than he could imagine. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the small living room. James stirred from his sleep in the armchair, still groggy from the night before. The events of the previous evening felt almost unreal until he glanced at the couch. She was still there, wrapped in the blanket, her pale blue skin glimmering faintly in the morning light. Max lay at her feet, his tail thumping gently as she scratched behind his ears. James sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Well, good morning," he said softly. The woman looked up, offering him a shy smile. She seemed less frightened now, though her expression carried a quiet sadness. He brought her a glass of water and some bread, figuring it was better than nothing until he could figure out what she actually ate. She hesitated at first, but eventually took a small bite, her eyes lighting up in surprise at the taste. James chuckled. "Not bad, huh? Just wait until I cook you something." As they sat in silence, James realized they couldn't go on like this. They had to find a way to communicate. He pointed to himself. "James," he said slowly. Then he pointed to her, raising his eyebrows in question. She tilted her head, trying to understand. After a moment, she pointed to herself and said, "Lyra." "Lyra," James repeated, nodding. She smiled, pleased that he got it right. Feeling encouraged, James tried something else. He pointed to Max, who was wagging his tail enthusiastically. "Max," he said. Lyra mimicked the name, patting Max on the head as if to thank him for his kindness. They spent the next hour like this, pointing to objects and exchanging words. James learned quickly that Lyra was a fast learner, picking up simple English words with ease. She even laughed when James pointed to himself again and exaggeratedly said, "Human." Her laughter was soft but genuine, and it warmed James's heart. It was the first time he'd seen her truly relax. For a moment, it felt like the tension and fear she carried had lifted, if only briefly. As the day went on, James noticed more of her curious nature. Lyra would touch things around the house, books, utensils, even the old radio on the shelf, with a childlike fascination. She tilted her head at the sound of music, her fingers hovering over the buttons as if trying to understand how it worked. Max stayed by her side, as though he had appointed himself her guardian. Whenever Lyra seemed unsure or frightened, he would nudge her hand or sit beside her, and she calmed down instantly. James couldn't help but feel a little jealous of how easily Max had won her trust. Later in the afternoon, James decided to test something. He brought out a notepad and pencil, handing them to Lyra. "Can you show me more?" he asked, gesturing for her to draw. Lyra hesitated for a moment before nodding. She began to sketch with surprising speed and precision. Her drawings were more detailed than the ones from the night before. This time, James could clearly make out what looked like a spaceship, its smooth lines and alien design unlike anything he'd ever seen. She then drew a jagged mark across it, as if to indicate it had crashed. Next, she sketched small, shadowy figures chasing a larger figure, herself. Her face darkened as she worked, her hand trembling slightly. James leaned closer. "They're after you, aren't they?" he asked, his tone gentle but serious. Lyra paused, then nodded, her eyes filled with worry. James sighed and sat back, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he said firmly. "You're safe here. We'll figure something out." Lyra looked at him, her expression softening with gratitude. She touched his hand briefly, as if to say thank you. Max barked in agreement, wagging his tail as though he understood the plan. As the sun set, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Lyra's pursuers were out there, and they wouldn't stop until they found her. But for now, she was here, and he wasn't about to let anything happen to her, not while Max and he were around. As the days passed, Lyra grew more comfortable in James's small, cozy home. She had learned a few simple words like thank you, yes, and safe, though much of their communication was still through gestures and expressions. James found himself oddly enjoying the challenge of understanding her. There was something pure about the connection they were building. Max, of course, had become her constant shadow. Wherever Lyra went, Max was right beside her, wagging his tail or nudging her hand for attention. She often spoke to him in her language, as though he could understand her. And somehow, Max seemed to respond, tilting his head or barking in a way that made Lyra laugh softly. One evening, while James was fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen, he heard a faint humming sound from the living room. Curious, he peeked around the corner and saw Lyra holding a strange device he hadn't noticed before. It was small, oval-shaped, and covered in glowing symbols that shifted and shimmered like living light. She pressed her fingers to its surface, and the humming grew louder, though the device itself appeared damaged. Its edges were cracked, and one corner was scorched. "What's that?" James asked, stepping closer. Lyra quickly hid the device behind her, her eyes wide with alarm. "It's okay," James said, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to take it from you." Lyra hesitated before slowly revealing the device again. She pointed to it, then to the sketch of her crashed ship she had drawn earlier. James's mind raced. This was no ordinary object. It was clearly advanced technology, something far beyond anything humans had created. "Is it broken?" he asked, pointing to the damaged part. Lyra nodded, her expression filled with frustration and worry. She tapped the device, and a weak spark flickered before it went dark again. James crouched beside her, studying the object. "You need this to go home, don't you?" he guessed. Lyra's eyes welled with tears as she nodded again. She pointed to the sky, then to herself, and then mimed a small explosion with her hands. James understood. Her ship had crashed, and this device was her only hope of contacting anyone from her world. "Well," he said, taking a deep breath, "let's see if we can fix it." Lyra looked at him with a mix of surprise and hope. James wasn't a scientist or an engineer, but he was good with his hands. Growing up on a farm had taught him how to repair just about anything with a little creativity and patience. This was different, of course, but he figured it was worth a shot. He set up a small workstation on the kitchen table, bringing out his toolbox and a magnifying glass. Lyra sat beside him, watching intently as he examined the device. It was delicate, its insides filled with tiny circuits that seemed to pulse faintly with energy. James wasn't sure where to start, but Lyra helped, pointing to parts and miming what they were supposed to do. As they worked, James noticed how focused Lyra became. She was clearly intelligent, her gestures precise and her eyes sharp. They made slow progress, but progress nonetheless. At one point, Max jumped up and placed his head on the table, wagging his tail as if offering moral support. Hours passed, and they managed to repair a small part of the device. When Lyra pressed it again, it emitted a faint, steady light. She gasped, her face lighting up with joy. James smiled, feeling a swell of pride. They weren't done yet, but it was a start. But their celebration was short-lived. As the device activated, a strange noise echoed from outside. Max's ears perked up, and he growled low in his throat, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" James whispered, standing and peering out the window. In the distance, faint, flickering lights moved through the forest, accompanied by an eerie hum. Lyra's face paled as she grabbed James's arm, her grip tight. She pointed to the device, then to the lights, shaking her head frantically. It was clear. The device had sent out a signal, and someone was coming. "Damn it," James muttered, quickly shutting off the lights in the house. He grabbed his flashlight and gestured for Lyra to stay quiet. Max barked once, softly but firmly, as if to say he was ready to protect them. "All right," James said under his breath. "Looks like we're not alone anymore." The tension in the room thickened as they prepared for whatever, or whoever, was approaching. The eerie hum from the forest grew louder, and the flickering lights became clearer. James stood by the window, peering through the curtain, his heart pounding. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't from this world. Lyra clutched Max tightly, her eyes wide with fear. Even Max, usually brave and bold, stayed unnaturally still, his ears flat against his head. James turned to Lyra and whispered, "Stay here. Don't move." He grabbed an old hunting rifle from the closet. It wasn't much, but it was the only weapon he had. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if whoever was out there came too close, he needed to be ready. Lyra shook her head, her grip tightening on his arm. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. She pointed to the device, then back to the forest, shaking her head. James understood. The signal from the device had likely drawn them here. If they got their hands on it, or her, it would be disastrous. James nodded, his jaw tightening. All right, we'll figure this out. But first, we need to stay hidden. He turned off every light in the house and led Lyra and Max to the small basement. It wasn't much more than a storage room filled with old tools and boxes, but it was dark and hidden. Lyra crouched in the corner, holding Max close as the dog stayed alert, his eyes fixed on the basement door. James climbed back up the stairs, leaving the door slightly ajar so he could listen. He moved quietly to the front window, his heart racing with every step. The flickering lights were now just beyond the tree line. 3 figures emerged, tall and shadowy, their movements smooth and unnaturally precise. They carried strange devices that glowed faintly, scanning the area as they moved. James gritted his teeth. These weren't people looking to help. They were hunters, cold and calculating. And they were getting closer. He needed to buy time. He grabbed an old radio from the shelf and carefully adjusted the settings until it emitted a faint static sound. James placed it on the back porch, the noise just loud enough to draw attention. Then, slipping out the side door, he moved silently toward the edge of the woods. The hunters paused when they heard the static. They turned toward the sound, their glowing devices aimed like weapons. James crouched low behind a tree, watching as they approached the porch. When they reached the radio, one of them tilted its head, examining it curiously. Then, with a swift motion, it smashed the radio with a single blow, silencing the static. James swallowed hard. These weren't ordinary beings. They were fast, strong, and clearly dangerous. He needed another distraction, something to lead them away from the house entirely. Back in the basement, Lyra listened intently, her hands gripping Max's fur. The dog's ears twitched, his body tense. He seemed to sense James's movements, his tail wagging faintly as if to reassure Lyra that James was still nearby. James, meanwhile, crept further into the woods, careful to stay out of sight. He picked up a large rock and hurled it into the trees, the loud crack echoing through the night. The hunters immediately turned toward the sound, their movements swift and coordinated. 2 of them headed in the direction of the noise, while the third stayed near the house, scanning the area with its glowing device. James clenched his fists. He had to lure all of them away. But how? His mind raced as he spotted an old, abandoned shed at the edge of the property. It was falling apart, but it could serve as a decoy. He quickly moved to the shed and kicked open the door, making as much noise as possible. The remaining hunter's head snapped toward the sound, and it began moving in his direction. James ducked inside the shed, holding his breath as the hunter approached. Back in the basement, Lyra glanced at the device she had hidden under her cloak. She knew it was her fault they were in danger. She looked at Max, then at the basement door. Determination replaced her fear. She couldn't let James handle this alone. As the hunter neared the shed, James readied himself. He wasn't sure what he'd do if it found him, but he had to protect Lyra and Max at all costs. Suddenly, a faint hum came from the direction of the house. James's heart sank. Lyra had turned the device on again. The hunter stopped in its tracks, its glowing scanner shifting toward the house. James cursed under his breath. "Lyra, what are you doing?" The hunter turned back, retreating toward the house as James scrambled out of the shed, desperate to get back before it was too late. The danger was far from over, and James knew they were running out of time. The house was eerily silent for a moment, save for the soft hum of Lyra's device. James could feel the tension in the air, the kind that made every sound feel too loud. He crouched near the basement stairs, gripping the rifle tightly, while Lyra sat in the corner, cradling the device. Max, ever loyal, stood by James's side, his sharp eyes fixed on the door above. The sound of footsteps returned, louder this time, as more hunters entered the house. Their movements were calculated, like predators closing in on prey. James knew they didn't have much time. "We can't stay here," James whispered to Lyra, his voice low but firm. She looked at him, her pale blue face a mixture of fear and determination. Lyra nodded, understanding the urgency. She powered down the device again and tucked it safely into her cloak. She pointed to the small basement window, her eyes pleading. James followed her gaze and nodded. It wasn't a great escape route. It was narrow and led into the backyard. But it was better than staying trapped. "All right, here's the plan," James whispered, turning to Lyra. "You and Max go through the window. I'll stay here and buy some time." Lyra shook her head, her hand gripping his arm tightly. "No," she said, her voice barely audible but firm. She pointed at the window, then to all three of them. Together. James hesitated, but the resolve in her eyes left no room for argument. He sighed. "Fine. But once we're out there, stick close. Max and I will handle anything that comes our way." Lyra nodded, and Max wagged his tail, as if he understood his role in the plan. James pushed a crate under the window and helped Lyra climb up. She wriggled through the narrow opening with surprising ease, landing softly in the damp grass outside. Max followed next, his agility making the escape look effortless. James took one last look at the basement before climbing out himself. As his feet hit the ground, he froze. The backyard was bathed in faint light from the hunters' scanning devices. Two figures moved methodically through the trees, their glowing eyes scanning for any trace of them. James motioned for Lyra to stay low, crouching behind a large bush. Max pressed close to her, his body tense but silent. James scanned the area, his mind racing for a plan. The hunters were moving closer, their steps crunching softly on the wet ground. James spotted an old rain barrel near the corner of the house, and an idea struck him. He grabbed a large rock and hurled it toward the barrel. The loud clang echoed through the yard, drawing the hunters' attention. They turned sharply, their scanners aimed at the noise. James took the chance to lead Lyra and Max toward the tree line, keeping low and moving quickly. The forest was their best chance at cover, but it was also risky. The hunters seemed to move through the trees with ease. As they entered the dense woods, James whispered to Lyra, "Keep moving. Don't stop unless I say so." She nodded, her pale blue face glowing faintly in the moonlight. The trio moved deeper into the forest, the trees casting long shadows in the dim light. James could hear the hunters behind them, their devices humming softly as they searched. His heart pounded, but he kept his focus. They just needed to stay one step ahead. Max suddenly stopped, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. James knelt beside him, trying to see what had caught the dog's attention. In the distance, he spotted a shallow stream cutting through the forest. The sound of running water masked their movements, and the wet ground would help obscure their scent. "This way," James whispered, leading Lyra and Max toward the stream. They waded through the cold water, careful to avoid making too much noise. The hunters' glowing lights flickered in the distance, but they seemed to lose the trail. As they reached the other side of the stream, Lyra paused, her eyes scanning the sky. She powered on the device briefly, its hum blending with the sound of the water. A soft pulse of light shot upward, disappearing into the night. She powered it off quickly and turned to James. "Help coming," she said, her voice soft but hopeful. James nodded, though his expression remained tense. "Let's hope they get here before those things do." The sound of the hunters' scanners grew faint, but James knew it wasn't over. For now, they had a head start, but the night was far from safe. Together, they pressed deeper into the forest, their only hope resting on the help Lyra had called for. The basement was dark and silent except for the faint hum of the device in Lyra's hands. Max sat beside her, his ears perked, his eyes darting toward the door, as if sensing something James couldn't see. Lyra's hands trembled as she adjusted the damaged device, her pale blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light. James burst into the basement, his breathing heavy, his face a mix of anger and fear. "What are you doing?" he hissed, closing the door quietly behind him. "I told you to stay hidden." Lyra looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with desperation. She pointed at the device, then gestured toward the door and the woods beyond. "Signal," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Safe." James ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Safe. Lyra, that thing brought them here. How is turning it on going to help?" She shook her head and tapped the device again. A small holographic image appeared, flickering weakly. It showed a map with glowing lines, all converging on their location. Lyra pointed to herself, then to one of the lines, then to the sky. She mimed something flying away. James stared at the map, his mind racing. "You're trying to call for help," he realized. Lyra nodded quickly, hope flashing in her eyes. "But what if they get to us before your help does?" James asked, his voice firm but not unkind. "We can't risk it." Lyra hesitated, her hands hovering over the device. She looked at James, then at Max, and finally nodded. She powered the device down, the light fading away. "Hide," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Danger." James knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out," he said softly. "But we have to be smart." Suddenly, Max growled low in his throat, his body tense. The faint sound of footsteps echoed above them, slow and deliberate. James froze. The hunters had made it to the house. He motioned for Lyra to stay quiet, then grabbed the rifle he had leaned against the wall. He crept up the stairs, Max following close behind. Through the crack in the basement door, James could see one of the hunters standing in the living room. Its tall, shadowy figure moved with eerie precision, scanning the area with its glowing device. James's grip on the rifle tightened. He wasn't sure what good it would do against something like that, but it was all he had. He motioned for Max to stay back, but the dog ignored him, inching forward silently. The hunter paused, its head tilting as if it had heard something. James held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The hunter moved toward the basement door, its steps unnervingly quiet. James's mind raced. If it opened the door, Lyra would be exposed. Suddenly, Max barked, loud and sharp, breaking the silence. The hunter spun around, its glowing scanner aimed at the dog. Max darted into the kitchen, barking again, drawing the hunter away from the basement. James took the opportunity to act. He slipped out of the basement, raising the rifle. "Hey!" he shouted, trying to keep the hunter's focus on him. The creature turned, its glowing eyes locking onto James. For a moment, James froze. The hunter's presence was overwhelming, its sheer size and otherworldly aura unlike anything he'd ever faced. But he quickly shook off his fear. He fired the rifle, the sound deafening in the small house. The bullet struck the hunter's device, sparks flying as it malfunctioned. The hunter staggered back, its movements jerky and disoriented. James didn't wait for it to recover. "Come on, Max," he shouted, grabbing the dog's collar and retreating toward the basement. Lyra was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, her face pale but determined. She held the device tightly, her fingers trembling as she powered it on again. "Help," she said, her voice steady this time. Now. The basement filled with a soft hum as the device emitted a new signal. James looked at her, then at Max, and nodded. "Let's hope your friends get here fast," he said grimly, "because we're out of time." Above them, the house creaked and groaned as more footsteps echoed through the rooms. The hunters weren't done yet, and James knew the real fight was just beginning. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant wildlife. But James, Lyra, and Max moved silently, their senses sharp. The stream they had crossed had bought them time. But James knew the hunters weren't far behind. The faint glow of their scanning devices occasionally flickered in the distance, a haunting reminder of the danger lurking nearby. Lyra clutched the device tightly to her chest, her pale blue skin shimmering faintly in the moonlight. Max stayed close to her side, his ears perked and his body tense. James led the way, his rifle in hand, scanning the forest for any sign of a safe place to rest. "We can't keep running like this," James whispered, glancing back at Lyra. She looked exhausted, her steps unsteady. Max nudged her gently, as if encouraging her to keep going. Just ahead, James spotted a large fallen tree with a hollow beneath it. It wasn't perfect, but it would provide some cover for a short break. He motioned for Lyra and Max to follow him. "Here," he said softly, helping Lyra down into the hollow. "We'll rest for a bit, but we have to stay quiet." Lyra nodded, her breathing heavy as she settled into the small space. Max lay beside her, his head resting on her lap, his steady presence offering her some comfort. James crouched nearby, his eyes scanning the forest for any movement. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The hunters' lights had disappeared, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. James allowed himself to relax slightly, though his grip on the rifle remained firm. Lyra broke the silence, her voice soft and hesitant. "Thank you, James," she said, her words slow but clear. It was one of the first full sentences she had managed, and her gratitude shone in her eyes. James gave her a small smile. "You're welcome, but we're not out of this yet." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the stars visible through the canopy above. "Help, soon," she said, her tone filled with quiet hope. James followed her gaze, the vast expanse of stars a stark reminder of how far from home she must feel. He didn't know much about her world or the people she was hoping would come, but he had to believe they would arrive in time. As they rested, Lyra powered on the device for a brief moment, checking its status. A soft pulse of light emitted from it, and a small holographic screen appeared, showing a timer counting down. James leaned closer, frowning. "What's that?" he asked. "Rescue signal," Lyra explained, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. She pointed to the timer. "Coming. Soon." James nodded, feeling a small flicker of relief, but soon wasn't now, and the hunters were still out there. Suddenly, Max's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. James tensed, his eyes scanning the darkness. The faint hum of the hunters' scanners returned, growing louder. They were closing in. "Time to move," James whispered urgently, helping Lyra to her feet. Max was already on alert, his body low to the ground as he prepared to defend them if needed. James led them deeper into the forest, moving quickly but carefully. The trees grew thicker, their dense canopy blocking out the moonlight. It was harder to see, but it also made them harder to track. As they navigated the uneven terrain, a distant light appeared in the sky. It wasn't like the hunters' scanners. It was brighter, steadier, and moving fast. Lyra's eyes widened, and she pointed to it, her face lighting up with hope. "Help," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. James squinted at the light. It was coming closer, its movement deliberate. He didn't know if it was friend or foe, but Lyra's reaction told him it was what they had been waiting for. "Let's keep moving," James said, his tone cautious. "We're not safe yet." The sound of the hunters grew louder, their lights flickering through the trees. But Lyra's rescue signal seemed to have drawn more than just the hunters' attention. As the bright light in the sky grew closer, it cast long shadows through the forest, illuminating the path ahead. For the first time, James felt a glimmer of real hope. If they could just hold out a little longer, they might make it through this alive. Together, they pushed forward, the light guiding their way as the forest came alive with the promise of rescue. The bright light in the sky grew closer, its glow piercing through the dense forest canopy. Lyra's pale blue face lit up with hope as she clutched the device tightly against her chest. James, however, couldn't let his guard down. The hunters were closing in, their eerie hum and faint lights flickering in the darkness behind them. "Stay close," James said, his voice low but firm. He gripped his rifle tightly, leading Lyra and Max toward the clearing ahead. The bright light from the sky now illuminated their path, casting long, moving shadows around them. As they approached the clearing, the ground shook slightly beneath their feet. The bright light descended, revealing a sleek, silver ship unlike anything James had ever seen. It hovered just above the ground, its surface smooth and glowing faintly with a soft, white energy. A door opened on its side, revealing a ramp that extended downward. Lyra's face lit up with relief. "Home," she whispered, pointing to the ship. But the relief was short-lived. From the edge of the clearing, the hunters emerged, their glowing scanners aimed directly at the group. There were more of them now, at least 5, their tall, shadowy figures moving with precision and menace. James cursed under his breath. "Go to the ship," he said to Lyra, stepping forward to place himself between her and the hunters. "I'll hold them off." Lyra hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but Max barked and nudged her toward the ship. She nodded reluctantly, her steps quick as she made her way toward the ramp. Max stayed behind, growling low as he stood beside James, ready to defend him. The hunters advanced, their glowing scanners emitting sharp beams of light. James raised his rifle, firing a shot that struck one of the hunters square in its chest. Sparks flew as the creature staggered backward, its scanner flickering and going dark. But the others didn't stop. They moved faster now, their glowing weapons raised. "Come on, you bastards," James muttered, firing another shot. This one missed, the bullet embedding itself in a tree. The hunters spread out, trying to flank him. James backed up slowly, his eyes darting between them. Suddenly, a high-pitched sound filled the air, making James wince. The ship had powered up, its glowing energy intensifying. A beam of light shot from its hull, striking one of the hunters and sending it flying into the trees. Lyra stood at the open ramp, her hands on the device, her face focused as she directed the ship's defenses. "Nice timing," James muttered, a small grin forming on his face. The hunters hesitated, their movements less coordinated now. Another beam from the ship struck the ground near them, creating a small explosion that sent dirt and debris flying. The hunters began to retreat, their scanners flickering as they disappeared back into the forest. James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned to Max, who wagged his tail, clearly pleased with their victory. "Good boy," James said, giving him a quick pat before motioning toward the ship. "Let's go." As James and Max approached the ramp, Lyra ran down to meet them. She reached for James's arm, her expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You're welcome," James replied, smiling despite the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. "Now let's get you out of here." Lyra led them up the ramp and into the ship. The interior was sleek and minimalist, with glowing panels and smooth surfaces that seemed alive with energy. Lyra quickly moved to a control panel, her fingers dancing over the glowing symbols. The ship hummed, lifting off the ground and rising above the treetops. Through the window, James watched as the forest disappeared beneath them. The hunters were gone, at least for now. He felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Lyra was safe, but this was the end of their journey together. Lyra turned to him, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "James," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Brave. Kind." James chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just did what anyone would do." Lyra shook her head, stepping closer. "Not anyone. Special." Max barked, wagging his tail as if agreeing. James smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "Yeah, we make a pretty good team." As the ship soared higher, Lyra pressed a button, and the device emitted a soft glow. A holographic screen appeared, showing a map of her destination. She pointed to it, then to herself, and finally to James, her expression serious. "Welcome," she said. "My home." James blinked in surprise. "You're inviting me to your world." Lyra nodded, her smile warm and genuine. For the first time since her arrival, the weight of fear seemed to lift from her shoulders. James looked at Max, who barked happily, his tail wagging furiously. "Well," James said with a grin, Looks like our adventure isn't over yet. The ship glided smoothly through the endless void of space, its glowing panels casting a soft light that gave the cabin a serene, almost dreamlike feel. James sat by one of the large windows, staring out at the sea of stars. He had never imagined leaving Earth, let alone being aboard an advanced spacecraft with a woman from another world. Max sat at his feet, his head resting on his paws but his tail wagging gently, as if sensing that this journey was something extraordinary. Lyra worked quietly at the control panel, her focus intense but her movements calm. She glanced back at James and Max every so often, her soft smile showing she was no longer afraid. The tense, frightened woman who had appeared at his doorstep was now someone full of quiet determination. James leaned back in his seat. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "where are we headed?" Lyra turned, pointing to the holographic map that hovered over her console. A glowing blue orb pulsed softly in the center. It had to be her home. "Safe place," she said, her words slow but clear. "My family." James nodded. "Your family's coming to meet us there." Lyra hesitated, her gaze dropping to the device in her hands. "Help," she said softly, tapping the glowing screen. "Sent message. They wait." James could tell there was more to her story, but he didn't press her. She'd already been through enough. Instead, he offered a reassuring smile. "Good. Sounds like we're in good hands." Max barked softly, his tail thumping against the floor. Lyra crouched beside him, scratching behind his ears. "Max, brave," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "Good friend." James chuckled. "Yeah, he's the best. I don't think we would have made it without him." The ship hummed, and a soft chime echoed through the cabin. Lyra straightened, her expression brightening. "Close," she said, pointing to the hologram. The blue orb grew larger, its surface detailed with glowing cities and vast landscapes. James's breath caught as the planet came into view through the window. It was stunning, unlike anything he'd ever seen. Swirling silver clouds wrapped around a surface dotted with shimmering lights and lush greenery. It was a living jewel in the vast emptiness of space. As the ship descended, Lyra moved to a smaller console, tapping a series of symbols. A message flashed across the screen, and moments later, a voice replied in her language. Lyra's face softened with relief. She looked back at James, her smile brighter than he'd ever seen it. "Family," she said simply, her hand resting on her heart. "Here." The ship landed gently in a clearing surrounded by towering crystalline trees that sparkled under a pale lavender sky. As the ramp lowered, a group of figures appeared, their features similar to Lyra's, but adorned in flowing robes of silver and white. Their expressions were a mix of relief and curiosity as they approached the ship. Lyra stepped forward, speaking quickly in her language. One of the figures, a tall man with an air of authority, placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening. He nodded, his gaze shifting to James and Max. James suddenly felt out of place, standing there in his worn boots and flannel shirt. But when the tall man extended a hand to him, James shook it, his grip firm. "Thank you," the man said, his voice accented but clear. "You saved my daughter." James blinked in surprise, glancing at Lyra. "Daughter?" he repeated. Lyra nodded, a shy smile on her face. Max barked, wagging his tail as if to break the tension. The group laughed softly, their voices melodic. The atmosphere felt lighter, the fear and danger of the past few days finally fading away. Lyra turned to James, her expression serious but kind. "Stay?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. "Our friend?" James hesitated, the weight of her question sinking in. This world was incredible, full of possibilities he couldn't have dreamed of. But Earth was still his home, and he wasn't sure he could leave it behind entirely. "I don't know," he admitted. "I mean, this place is amazing, but my life, it's back there." Lyra nodded, her eyes understanding but tinged with sadness. She reached out, touching his hand lightly. "Welcome, always." James smiled. "Thanks, Lyra. That means a lot." The figures led Lyra away, but she turned back once more, her gaze lingering on James and Max. She placed her hand on her heart, then pointed to them, a gesture James understood immediately. "Take care, Lyra," James said softly, waving. Max barked, wagging his tail as if to say goodbye. As the ship powered up to return them to Earth, James leaned back in his seat, watching Lyra's world grow smaller in the distance. He didn't know what the future held, but he was certain of one thing. Meeting Lyra had changed his life forever. And somewhere out there, he knew he had a friend who would always remember him.